Hello everyone, welcome back to this second session for day 2, which is session 5 of this 3-day event. We'll be looking at life underwater. Just if you're joining us for this session for the first time, please know you can enter your questions in the control panel. You'll see a section labelled questions. You can submit them through there for the final question and answer session that will happen with all the speakers at the end of the session. If you're a speaker, you won't have a question box, but you can submit them through the chat function. It's now my pleasure to hand over to our chair for this Life Underwater session, which is Professor James Harris from Flinders University. Thank you, James.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Mayor. You're a bit overly generous there. I'm only Associate Professor. Hello and welcome, everybody. We're looking at a session today where the first talk, or it's for Life Underwater, where the first talk is titled, Does Aquatic Animal Welfare Matter? And it's going to be presented by Culum Brown from Macquarie University here in Australia. Now,
Good day everybody, my name's Professor Culum Brown. I'm from Macquarie University, and today I'm going to be asking a question: does aquatic animal welfare matter? Humans interact with aquatic animals in many ways, and all of them have welfare implications. Aquatic animals are a major source of human protein captured from wild stocks. Of course, wild populations can't cope with demand, so aquaculture is rapidly filling this gap. Recreational fishing is extremely popular pastime and has a very strong political lobby. Fish are the most numerous pet in the world. Fish are ranked after rats and mice in scientific experiments. And if you're interested in biodiversity, there are more species of fish than the rest of the vertebrates combined. People tend to think of fish as mindless automatons. And the scientific reality is that they're actually pretty smart, just as smart and sometimes smarter than land animals. And here's a list of traits that might reasonably associate with intelligence. And over the last 10 years or so, all of these behaviours have not only been shown to occur in fishes, but fishes have led the way as model species. Intelligence, sentience, and welfare are tied together. But because people have very low opinions of fish intelligence, they tend not to show them any empathy. And the gap between public perception of fish intelligence and scientific reality has serious implications for our interactions with fish, not least of which because public opinion drives animal welfare legislation. One of the controversial topics in fish biology is whether or not fish feel pain. And the simple answer is yes. The reason you and I feel pain at all is probably because we inherited our pain receptors from our fishy ancestors. In fact, nociceptors date back to the annelids. The debate is no longer about whether they can detect noxious stimuli, but rather how they respond at an emotional level. That is, are they cognitively engaged with pain? Are they sentient? Some have argued that because fish brains are a little different from our own, they aren't sentient and can't feel pain in the same way that we do. It's been suggested that human pain perception partially occurs in the cortex, and since fish don't have a human cortex, they can't feel pain. Now, presumably, that logic applies to other animals as well. And while fish brains develop a little differently from other vertebrates during ontogeny, all studies of fish brains to date certainly suggest that the structure may be a little bit different, but they still perform the same sorts of functions as other vertebrate brains. So the structure-function argument just doesn't hold. And of course, this gets even more difficult when we start talking about cephalopods or decapod crustaceans. To illustrate just how naive this structure-function fallacy is, let's take a look at vision as a nice analogy. Humans also use their cortex to process visual information, and it would be bordering on the ridiculous to suggest that animals that don't have a cortex also cannot see. Fish, of course, use parts of their forebrain, the telencephalon, their optic lobes, and the cerebellum to process visual information. Rather than concentrating on how the human brain processes painful stimuli, let's stop and think about why we feel pain at all. That is, what is the evolutionary significance of pain perception? What's its function? Now, pain perception and the associated emotional response is an ancient, highly conserved evolutionary trait. This is no surprise, given that the fundamental job is to keep the animal safe from harm. And there are really two main components as I see it. The first is a nociceptive reflex. Well, there's no cognition required here, just an emergency removal away from a painful stimulus. And in fact, this is what the fish pain deniers will tell you is the only thing fish are capable of. And the second component, and I think the more important one, is this long-term consolidation. Remembering that object X or context Y is dangerous and we should stay away in future. And this is where cognition and emotions are important. There's no sense in detecting painful stimuli if you don't then remember to avoid them again in future. There has to be cognitive engagement for the system to work. Without it, having just been burnt, you would literally turn around and walk straight back into the fire. The emotional response to painful stimuli, which by definition is pain, is a strong negative reinforcer to ensure that we learn from that experience. In the expression of the emotions in man and animals, Charles Darwin describes the close connection between human emotions and their evolutionary precursors in animals. Darwin proposed that the emotions are adaptive. They serve to motivate behaviour, but also to act as a form of communication, a means to outwardly express an animal's inner states. Objects or contexts in the world around us vary in emotional salience and valence, which can be edited via life experiences. And at the most fundamental level, emotions guide animal behaviour by motivating rewarding behaviour or discouraging behaviour that results in punishment. And from a neurophysiological perspective, fishes possess functional equivalents of the limbic and dopaminergic nervous systems, systems that are directly linked with emotion. They also have dedicated parts of the brain that deal with this information. For example, the median pallium processes negative emotional memories. To probe people's thoughts and feelings, the general approach in human psychology is to ask a bunch of questions and analyze the responses. You can ask a human, did that hurt? But you can't really do that for animals. However, you can look for behavioral signs and symptoms of pain in humans, such as limping, loss of appetite, crying, withdrawal, protecting the injury, and so on. Of course, a child that cannot talk is still capable of experiencing pain, it just may not be able to report it verbally. And in the case of animals, and of course in young children, we rely on these observations of evidence and signs and symptoms, as it were, of pain. And to understand what animals are feeling, you really need to carry out experiments and let their behaviour tell you the story. So what does the behavioural evidence tell us about pain perception in aquatic animals? This is a table showing the criteria for animals' capacity to feel pain. Some of the criteria are neurological or physiological in nature, but you'll notice that many of them are based on behavioural changes that we can observe directly. The main thing I want to point out is that the evidence for fish pain is just as good as it is for mammals and birds. And in fact, the evidence we have for decapod crustaceans is reasonably good as well, and certainly the evidence for cephalopods is coming along in leaps and bounds. The behaviours I have here marked in asterisks, red asterisks, are really the ones that definitely involve higher levels of cognitive processing of painful stimuli. And what I want to do is just illustrate what some of these experiments look like using case studies. Here you can see the influence of trout infected with acetic acid or bee venom relative to a saline control or a control line that has just been handled. And on the y-axis is the amount of time it takes for the animals to begin feeding again. And it's quite obvious that those animals that have these noxious stimuli applied to them take a much longer to return to feeding compared to controls. Similar lines of evidence here show the change in activity or the change in opercular beat rate. Again, saline controls, those exposed to acid and a range of different painkillers. And the main thing to point out here is that activity goes down. So there's a decline in activity when the fish are exposed to a painful stimuli, and the application of a local anesthetic, lidocaine, restores behavior somewhat. Same with breathing rate, percular beat rate here. The breathing rate goes up when they're exposed to this noxious stimuli, and the application of lidocaine helps restore the normal behavior. Slightly more sophisticated setup here, which asks the fish to make trade-offs, decisions between what it wants. And there are multiple, often conflicting situations that animals find themselves in, and they have to decide what is the most cost-effective response. In this case, we have a setup where a fish is in this aquarium, there's a clear partition, and in some treatments there's a conspecific on the other side that is a companion, and sometimes there's not. And the trick is that when the fish enters this compartment, it may receive a zap. And so the fish has to decide, well, do I pay the cost of pain in order to access my companion? And although this may look like a bit of a horrendogram, I can certainly walk you through it reasonably easy. We have the far side of the aquarium, the safe side, the middle zone, and the side that they potentially get shocked on, which is also the side that is closest to companion. In the black, we have the no fish treatment, and we have the companion animal present. And you can quite clearly see that when there is no fish present, and before the shock, the animal is evenly distributed across the aquarium, which is hardly surprising. And then after the shock and during the shock, it gets as far away from the shock side as it possibly can. The opposite happens when there is a companion fish. Unsurprisingly, the fish wants to spend time close to its companion prior to shocking. Even during the application of the shock, it spends a significant amount of time close to the companion, and afterwards it even increases the amount of time. And the reason for this is that they value companionship very highly, even if there's the application of a shock. And they perhaps increase that preference afterwards, because often fish look to school, that is, they search for social companionship when they're scared or threatened in some way. So this quite clearly shows that the fish are willing to pay a cost in terms of pain in order to get access to a companion. And similar experiments have been done with food as the reward rather than a companion. And in that case, if the fish has been starved for 3 days or more, then they value the food over the potential to get shocked. This is one of my favorite examples. And in this case, a fish is given a choice between an enriched compartment on one side and another side, which is a bare compartment, but it has some sort of analgesia in it. Of course, a normal fish would show an overwhelming preference for the complex environment and avoid the plain environment. But should that fish be given a painful stimuli, again perhaps an acetic acid injection in the lips, then they forego access to the complex environment and prefer to self-administer the painkiller. So we can briefly summarize what we've talked about to date. Fish are intelligent creatures. The evolutionary function of pain perception is ancient and highly conserved in all vertebrates and possibly some invertebrates. Neurons for pain perception are present in fish. Various parts of the brain that are responsible for emotional responses are also present in fish. Fish are cognitively engaged with pain, that is, they're sentient. They have the expected behavioural and physiological responses to pain. Painkillers return behaviour to normal, as one would expect, and fish are making complex trade-offs between pain and other needs. This is clearly not reflexive behaviour. So the question then, of course, is, well, why does this matter? If the scientific evidence suggests fish are smart enough to suffer and respond to pain in similar ways to the rest of the vertebrates, what are the implications for how we treat fish in the wider community? What are the welfare implications? And in particular, the implications for commercial fishing and aquaculture are kind of mind-boggling. To give you some idea of the scale of the issue we're dealing with here, let's just think of the number of individual fish that are killed each year for human consumption by commercial fishing. And this does not include bycatches and other commercial landings that are not reported to the FAO. The number is somewhere between 1 and 3 trillion individuals. That's compared to 57 billion birds or 3 billion mammals. By comparison, the number of terrestrial animals killed each year for human consumption seems trivial. What's more, in the 70s, there was a massive push, initially in the UK, by the general public to protect the welfare of animals in industrial aquaculture, but for some reason, that never made it to fishers. About 405 fish are killed per person per year, compared with 0.4 mammals and 7.7 birds. So the impact of the welfare, from a welfare perspective, is somewhere between 53 to 1,000-fold greater than the terrestrial meat production systems. So let's consider the animal welfare legislation in Australia as an example, just to see where fish stand. And if fish are sentient, we have to ask the question, is the legislation fit for purpose? And I think the first thing to realise is that there's no federal legislation in Australia. Animal welfare is a state territory thing, and it's highly inconsistent. For the most part, it bears little resemblance to science and is largely shaped by politics. In Australia, there is no protection for fish when captured in the wild or in any state or territory. In every case, fish are either excluded from the definition of animal or they are exempt. Only in Tasmanian legislation is there any mention of welfare within the fisheries legislation. But there is moves that perhaps this might change in New South Wales. And what about from an aquaculture perspective? As I've mentioned, aquaculture is growing rapidly to fill the gap from our failing wild populations. And in at least 3 states, I think fish would be covered by existing animal welfare legislation, which is a significant improvement on wild fisheries, but still not great. We clearly have a long way to go. So, some take-home messages. Fishes and other aquatic animals are likely sentient. We interact with them in multiples of ways. The sheer numbers of individuals that are impacted is huge. It's in the trillions. Aquatic animal welfare is about 1,000 times more urgent than anything we see in the terrestrial system, and existing legislation is inconsistent and not fit for purpose. And here is some suggested reading that you may or may not want to browse in your own time.
Well, thank you very much, Culum. Hopefully it's coming through clearly. That was really interesting and strongly put case for the welfare of aquatic animals. The next presenter that we have here is Stephani Lopes, and also with Culum Brown, presenting work on the Australian shark control programs and the animal welfare implications associated with these.
Hi everyone, my name is Stephani and today we are going to talk about Australian shark control programs and its animal welfare implications. This work involves me and my supervisor Culum Brown, who are both at Macquarie University. Shark-human interactions do not happen very often, but once they do, they are quite traumatic experiences. It also involves a lot of media attention and public consent. So after several bites in New South Wales, the shark meshing program started in 1937. The program makes use of nets and drumlines or a combination of both to try and stop shark bites. As you can see on this picture, the nets are quite large, so they can catch different types of marine animals. With the drumlines, there are 2 types of them, normal drumlines and smart drumlines. With the normal ones, there is a baited hook at the bottom that once the animal bites it, it has to wait for the service of the gears for them to be released. And with the smart drumlines, there is a satellite on it, which means that it sends you a signal once the shark bites the hook, so then you can go there and release the sharks or the animals in it as soon as possible. The shark control program has the goal of targeting large shark species, the ones bigger than 1.5 meter length, because once the sharks get to this body size, they are considered hazardous for humans. So what I'm saying with that is that the shark control program is actually targeting large shark species such as white sharks, bull sharks, and tiger sharks. It's also worth to mention that these are two vulnerable species and one near-threatened species. So having the goal of targeting these large apex predators is already a big problem. When we look at the animal welfare implications involving the shark control program, we know that back in 1937, when the program just started, there was little, if any, concerns about the impact that this program would have on the environment. And now we know that taking large shark species out of the environment can affect food diversity and web dynamics. Another problem with the shark control program is that it's not catching only its target species, it's catching a big variety of marine fauna, including threatened and endangered species, which is causing a lot of concerns at the moment. I even saw a joke on the internet about the net saying, basically, is that really a shark net because it doesn't catch a lot of sharks? Anyway, to give you some perspective of the numbers and what's actually happening in the shark control program, I've got some data about the last season. And out of 376 animals caught in total, 86.5% of that are non-target species. And only 51 were the target sharks that they were looking for. Out of these 51 sharks being caught, 35 ended up dead. And in total, in New South Wales, only in the last season, we have 234 animals dead. Unfortunately, most of the animals caught by the shark control programs do not survive. And the ones that do, we just don't know what happens to them because there is no follow-up of these animals to see if they actually survive it after a few hours, they will release it, what happens to them. So I guess we will need a lot of research in the future to actually see how many animals survive after being released by the meshing program. As you guys saw in the picture previously of the nets, they are quite large and they are situated from the top to the middle of the water column. So what happens is most of the animals caught by the nets are pelagic species that need to go back to the surface to breathe, or they need ventilation to breathe. So once they get crawling in the nets, they can't swim anymore, they can't breathe anymore, and these animals ended up drowning, and that's the biggest reason of death involving the shark control program. We also know that in the last season, out of 376 animals caught, only 142 were released alive, and we don't actually know what happened to them after they were released. The baited hooks are also one of the animal welfare implications when we talk about the shark control program, because once the animal bites the hook, it's causing a physical damage on them straight away. So these animals get trapped in the hooks and stay there, probably feeling pain, probably feeling a lot stressed for hours until the service happens. So they ended up dying this way. And when we look at pictures like that, it just makes me think that there is not a lot of concerns about the animals' welfare when we talk about catching sharks. There is no thoughts on how can we improve that? How can we change the situation? How can we cause less damage on the animals? So when we look at all the problems involving the shark control program and all the animal welfare implications, this makes me ask myself, is that worth it? Is that worth to kill 234 animals in one season only in New South Wales because of one or two incidents that happen in the whole country in 1 year time? So I will leave you guys with this question to make you think about that. But on the other hand, I think the biggest question to be answered when we talk about the shark control program is how can we change the situation? How can we improve? So I think replacing the baited drum lines with smart drum lines is a good idea because it would catch more of the target species than a general variety of marine fauna. It would also consequently increase the service of the nets which would be very good. And removing the nets would be another solution, as it doesn't catch a lot of target species anyway. Making use of non-lethal strategies such as drums and weather predictions are also a very good and valid idea. So when we talk about bull sharks, for example, we know that we can predict the presence of these animals in the water, looking at weather variations such as rainfall, sea surface temperature. So why not looking at the forecast, trying to predict the presence of these animals in the water, and then educating swimmers not to go to the water in certain moments when it's necessary. On top of that, being aware of the situation and of the problems is already a big thing, because this way we can put pressure on the government to try and improve the situation for us and for the animals as well. So I've seen recently communities in New South Wales going against the shark control program and asking the government to stop it, mainly in the northern beaches, which is very nice. I would like to say thank you to my both labs, the Fish Lab and the Mag Lab, and also to Macquarie University for the funding and support.
Where is it? Oh,
Yeah, we can see you and hear you, James.
I'm sorry, I didn't think I had it set on correctly. All right, welcome to the next speaker. So here we have Stacy Fairfax from the Dolphin Marine Conservation Park in Australia to tell us about these animals in our care. Thank you.
Hello, and welcome to Assessing Cetacean Welfare Under Human Care. My name is Stacy Fairfax, and I am the Animal Welfare Officer at Dolphin Marine Conservation Park in Coffs Harbour, Australia. I have a master's degree in marine science and management and a bachelor's degree that specializes in behavioral psychology. Today, we're going to talk a bit about some of the ethical concerns for housing cetaceans under human care and how to properly assess the welfare of those animals living under human care. Now first, let's have a look at some of the common concerns about cetaceans under human care. First, a lack of space. Dolphins would usually travel long distances every single day out in the wild. Second, animal rights advocates argue that it is unsuitable to keep dolphins in captivity due to their high level of intelligence. Thirdly, they insist that these animals may experience social restrictions when out in the wild they would be living in fission-fusion societies that lead to a large variability in their social structures. It has been documented that some animals in captivity experience stress, leading to long-term health issues. Dolphins under human care may also lack some of the natural foraging opportunities that they would out in the wild, and often are seen performing circusy-like behaviors for public presentations or demonstrations. Animal rights advocates also argue that the environment itself is unsuitable for cetaceans, highlighting that the animals are not able to use their echolocation, that the environments are often barren, and that the water is treated with chlorine or other similar chemicals. Now, at face value, all of these points are extremely concerning, and one might say, of course, dolphins should not be in captivity, given all of these points. However, as scientists, it is important that we separate fact from propaganda. So let's have a look at the following statement. Captive dolphins live in chlorinated habitats. Let's research the facts. Below, I've added some links to sydneywater.com. This website gives daily water quality reports for the different Sydney suburbs. I've also included a link at the very bottom to the DPI, or Department of Primary Industries, for New South Wales. Now, the DPI standards are what every facility that houses animals under human care in New South Wales have to follow. They have a specific set of standards for dolphins as well. So the link at the very bottom is specifically for the dolphin standards. While some captive dolphins live in sea pens, others live in facilities that have treated filtered water. Now, sea pens are a naturalistic environment that has been fenced off from the ocean that allows natural water exchange due to tidal flows every single day. Other facilities, like Dolphin Marine Conservation Park, have a semi-open system in which dolphins have natural filtered seawater pumped in every single day, but it is filtered and treated before it reaches their environment. Now, the New South Wales standards ensure that the concentration of chlorine in the dolphin's environment is less than 1 part per million. However, the legal standards for drinking water in New South Wales can actually contain up to 5 parts per million in some suburbs. Here in Coffs Harbour, we often get readings of 0.08 to 3 parts per million. Just like in our drinking water, the chlorine is present to kill any potential pathogens that can be present in the water that may make the dolphins ill. Let's have a look at another statement.
Yeah, go for it.
Dolphins cannot use their echolocation in concrete pools. Let's look at the facts. How can we test this? In the video, you'll see Bella wearing silicone eye cups so that she's blindfolded and cannot find this ring visually. She's sent off and uses her echolocation to find the ring. Please feel free to play the video once more.
GoPro, stop recording.
I'll pause so you can play that once more.
Yeah, go for it. GoPro, stop recording. GoPro, stop recording.
Excellent. So let's jump back to some of the common concerns about cetaceans under human care. You can already see that some of these arguments are starting to have holes in them, and some of them are just plain disproven. Now, other of these arguments are actually extremely concerning. For example, the social restrictions. Dolphins under human care do have a limited group in which they can interact. Now, as scientists, we need to investigate every argument empirically. We need to use empirical or scientific evidence to measure welfare and make assessments and decisions. So how do you measure cetacean welfare in 2022? There's actually quite a few options for us to empirically measure cetacean welfare in this day and age. We can use those 5 domain assessments that are pretty common around the zoological industry. Dolphin Marine Conservation Park is accredited by the Zoological and Aquarium Association, or ZA for short, and this is the third-party organization that monitors and assesses zoological facilities for positive welfare practices in all of the Australasia region. But there are organizations like this all around the world, including the EAZA in Europe, the AZA in America, and so on. Now, the Seawell assessment is actually a cetacean welfare assessment that was designed by Dr. Isabella Clegg to specifically focus on cetacean species and include measurements that are specific or more focused on cetaceans rather than the 5-domain assessments by ZA or those third-party organizations. They do have to be generalized welfare assessments because they have to be able to be applied across a variety of zoological species, from reptiles to meerkats to dolphins and so on. So the sea whale was specifically designed by Dr. Kleb with cetaceans in mind. So we'll talk about that in just a moment as well. You can also do physiological studies looking at biomarkers. So here at Dolphin Marine Conservation Park, we did a study to look at cortisol levels after the animals engaged in interaction programs. So we'll talk about that a bit as well. You can utilize behavioral observations, and this is actually super easy for all of the staff to learn and very non-invasive for the animals. And it's very important to understand the animals that we're caring for. And so just by sitting and observing the behavior in a very informal fashion can be just as important as implementing formalized ethograms that allow you to compare the animal's behaviors over time and look at behavior changes and pattern with all kinds of different things in mind, things like socials, abnormal behaviors. You can assess all of these by implementing formal behavioral ethograms. The Cetacean Welfare Assessment, or CWEL for short, was designed by Dr. Isabella Clegg and uses both animal-based and resource-based measures to holistically measure cetacean welfare. Animal-based measures evaluate quantifiable aspects of the individual animal. Resource-based measures may evaluate the resources available to all the animals in that collection. It would not be suitable to simply look at resource-based measures to evaluate animal welfare because each individual experiences its environment differently. Affective states are subjective to the individual. Take, for example, if you and I were in the same room, we would be experiencing varying levels of thermal comfort. I might be cold while you're comfortable. So it's important to look at those animal-based measures as well as the resource-based measures to analyze the effects and differences among individuals. The CWEL assessment is developed with the 5-domain model in mind, but just looking at and analyzing cetacean-specific parameters. Dr. Clegg's CWEL assessment is a good method to measure cetacean welfare under human care in general. However, at Dolphin Marine Conservation Park, we wanted to more specifically look at whether or not our animal visitor interactions were stressful for our dolphins. Cetaceans are often used in animal visitor interactions when they're housed under human care, but there are limited evidence about the effects these programs have on cetacean welfare. And animal rights advocates often claim that these interactions can be stressful for the animals. When we're housing animals under our care, we do have a duty of care to ensure that we're providing them with optimal welfare. So we wanted to measure this scientifically. So what we did is we looked at both biomarkers and behavior. Now we had 3 different treatments. We had control, poolside, and in water. So at Dolphin Marine Conservation Park, we do have 2 different types of guest interactions the dolphins will participate in. We've got poolside interactions where the guests actually stand outside of the animal's enclosure, and we have in-water interactions where the guests enter into the animal's enclosure. Now, the control group had no interaction with guests on that day. And what we did was we actually took voluntary blood samples within 30 minutes after the dolphins completed those guest interactions. Or, in the case of the control group, we took a blood sample at that same time of day as if they were in a guest interaction, but the animals did not have any interaction with guests. We also wanted to look at behavior. So we took behavioral observations 10 minutes before and 10 minutes after guest interactions, and we wanted to actually look at the behavioral change. So we'll talk first about the blood samples. So we wanted to look at the cortisol concentrations in the dolphin's blood, as that's often linked or associated with a level of stress. So we took those blood samples within 30 minutes after the interaction, to examine whether or not that stress response had been triggered. And what we saw was that overall, our dolphins were exhibiting a low concentration of cortisol in their bloods when compared with the literature. And our range was 13 to 43 nanomoles per liter, with an average reading of 15.28 nanomoles per liter. So what that indicated to us was that our dolphins actually weren't experiencing that physiological stress response after those guest interactions. Now, when looking at behavior, we actually saw a few really interesting trends. However, there was no statistical change in behavior. When looking at average behavior changes, we actually had an increase in a few of those behaviors associated with positive welfare after our guest interaction treatments. So what that means is behaviors associated with positive welfare, things like interaction with enrichment, pair or social swimming, and interaction with people, actually all increased after guest interaction, and both types of interaction at that. Now let's talk about this interaction with people category. So this measurement was really interesting to me because at Dolphin Marine Conservation Park, our dolphins do have access to the guests at the poolside and can swim by and elicit pats from our guests at the poolside, or they can bring their footballs or basketballs over and engage in a game of catch with our guests. Now, this is not in a training session. It's entirely up to the animals when, if at all, they do interact with our guests at the poolside. So I thought it pretty interesting that even after they were engaging in both the poolside and the in-water interactions, they still chose to go and interact with our guests at the poolside. And again, because this is entirely on their terms, it's very reassuring that our animals still want to go over and interact with our guests. Now, there are other behaviors associated with negative welfare, things like circular swimming or solitary swimming. And those behaviors actually decreased on average after both types of interactions. Now, that's kind of self-explanatory because, of course, if the animals are doing other things with their time, so if you see an increase in those other behavioral categories like interaction with enrichment and social swimming, then of course they're going to spend less of their time solitary swimming. Now, interestingly, we actually saw an increase in those behaviors associated with negative welfare, things like circular swimming or solitary swimming. We actually saw an increase of those on average in the control group. So when the dolphins did not participate in those guest interactions. So what do these results mean? Again, it's reassuring that there were no differences in cortisol levels among those treatments, and it indicates that the animal stress response were not triggered by the animal visitor interactions. There was also a general trend of an increase in behaviors associated with positive welfare, but there was still a lack of statistical significance. So it would be important for us to recreate this study over time to see if we can elicit any more of those changes or elicit kind of a stronger statistical power by increasing the amount of samples we have. Overall, we as an organization have a better understanding of the implications that our animal visitor interactions have on our dolphins. And if we continue to do research such as this one or continue to implement these methods to continue this research over time, it will contribute to an improved understanding of our animals and thus improved management and welfare outcomes for our animals. So what do you do after you empirically assess welfare? I cannot stress enough the importance of using empirical measurements to analyze animal welfare. As we as humans tend to have a natural tendency to look at everything through our own lens. Unfortunately, this can cause us to then make inaccurate conclusions about animal welfare and thus animal management practices. So it's important that we undergo these empirical assessments regularly to analyze our animals' welfare and identify any specific welfare concerns. Using our empirical assessments, we can make educated decisions and develop plans to rectify these welfare concerns. And again, then remeasure and ensure that the practices you've implemented are actually having the intended changes. I want to thank everyone for their time and attention today, and just thank everyone for keeping an open mind. I encourage each of you to think critically about this topic. When housing animals under human care, there are many ethical considerations, and cetaceans under human care has always been a contentious topic. I do encourage anyone to utilize these empirical evaluations to assess animal welfare. If you feel at any time your ethical judgment could be clouded by any personal feelings or anthropomorphism. I do encourage everyone to reach out if they do have any further questions or comments to the email address below. Thanks again, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the presentation and enjoy the rest of your time at the conference.
Hello. Have I got the audio on? Yes. Hello. Welcome. Does anyone have a question at the moment? We have one that I can see in amongst the chat section that's quite long. So perhaps, Culum, if you'd like to address that.
I have to read it first.
Yeah.
I can read it if you like.
Yeah, maybe you can do that because it's very small.
Yeah, no, it's okay. Just reflecting on the experimental design of studies such as the shock when accessing a conspecific and considering whether an animal ethics committee would approve that for use on another sentient species such as dogs. To me, this just really highlights how people's attitudes towards these different species vary. How long do you think it might take for those attitudes to catch up with the evidence? And what do you think that might mean for how we interact with fish, especially given managed fish populations appear to be increasingly pointed to as an alternative to larger land mammals as a human food source with less climate impact?
Yeah, that's a good question. In fact, those studies were done more than 15 years ago now. So we've known about these sorts of responses for a long time. And I should point out that the voltage involved is very, very low. It's 2.5 volts or something. So it's extremely low. It's much lower than, for example, a shock that cattle or sheep would get from a standard electric fence or anything like that. I personally would rather go with alternative methods, and looking at how fish might respond to various needs and wants by contrasting options and giving them options to choose from and those sorts of things. But I think we are still a long way away from parity in terms of how the public view fish welfare in general. I lived in the UK for many years, and even though they're very advanced in terms of their perspectives in animal welfare, I had a lot of friends that were vegetarian but still ate fish, which is kind of weird. I mean, fish aren't potatoes, so that's an interesting contrast. And increasingly, even within the scientific realm, we're seeing this transformation, particularly for medical research, where increasingly things like zebrafish are being used instead of rats and mice, which is one of the reasons why the number of fish used in experiments and scientific experiments is increasing exponentially. And that theoretically is partially done to reduce the overall welfare impact. But there is, of course, another reason that's operating in the background, and that is it's just a lot easier to keep a huge number of zebrafish in captivity relative to the number of rats and mice. It's much cheaper. You can fit a heck of a lot more animals in a very small space because the zebrafish are only this big. Of course, there's increasing interest in zebrafish welfare in those sorts of high density systems that they're increasingly using in medical research as well, looking at increasing habitat complexity and those sorts of things. So look, we are gradually improving, but I think society is still a long way behind in terms of how we view fishes more generally as a food source, as companion animals and these sorts of things.
I can help with that a little, Culum, by adding the difference between aquaculture and fishing industry at present. We have the principles of animal welfare when it comes to slaughter applied to the aquaculture industry, but they're not applied in any instance to the fishing industry. So it's just a matter of degree of how long before the fish asphyxiate in every single fishing incident.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally agree. I mean, people often ask me, where would you start in terms of addressing the problems with animal welfare? And I always say aquaculture, because aquaculture production for human consumption now has overtaken wild capture fisheries. And I think there's a lot we can do in that context. Whereas for wild capture, I mean, yes, there have been some attempts to improve welfare in wild capture situations, but in all honesty, the economic reality is that it just wouldn't be feasible in most cases.
Yeah. Are there any other questions coming through?
Yes, we've got another one for Culum, which is the scale of the welfare challenge for the commercial fish industry is huge. Do different species of fish have different welfare challenges? And does this then reflect how easy or hard it will be to make some broad legislative protection for fishers?
Yes, I mean, this is one of the problems we face. I'm also on a bunch of committees looking at developing welfare measures for aquaculture, and of course the difference between aquaculture and agriculture meat production systems is that you're dealing with about 350 different species in aquaculture. That's just fish species, not including invertebrates.
Yep.
So the diversity is huge. They all have different sensory mechanisms, different living requirements. Their social requirements are all different. And so there's not going to be a golden bullet solution. It's going to be a species by species thing. So it's extremely difficult to come up with generalizations. And the other reality we face is that many of these species are only new to captivity. It's unlike cows and sheep and these sorts of things that have been domesticated for thousands of years. Many of these fish species are, just several generations into captive life. And the reality is many of them, I would say most of them, are just not suited to life in captivity. A really classic example of the salmonids, right? I mean, if you were to choose a fish to go in aquaculture from first principles, it would not be salmonids. They're migratory. They have salt and freshwater parts of their life cycles. They move huge distances. They're actually antisocial as juveniles. They consume a crazy amount of protein in order to get the actual amount of protein you put in is less than the protein you get out at the end of the day. So there are lots of poor management decisions that have been made in terms of, deciding what species we should be cultivating and which ones we shouldn't. But unfortunately, that's based on human preferences rather than what's good for the different animals. And then coming back to, different species in the wild, well, that's going to depend on how they're caught, where they're caught, and why they're caught. So there's lots of different methods for capturing fishes across the board. Some of the good examples of welfare are some of the highly prized tuna, where they're hooked on a single line, they're drawn into the boat within seconds, and they're dispatched humanely and stored, usually on ice. And that in complete contrast to trawl nets, where the animals are crushed and drowned and suffocate on deck. So there's a huge variety of methods for capturing fish and a massive disparity in terms of the welfare outcomes. And if you look at it, it really comes down to the value of the individual animals.
Another thing that contributes to that is the available technology to support each of those. So we had salmonids develop as a big industry because there's been over 100 years of work in them. We have local species that are being developed and are increasing, but each of them require tens of years of development to make sure that we're addressing all their nutritional needs, all of these welfare issues with them, all of the disease issues that come up. So there are,
Yeah.
it's a long path to getting these things working as well as we can.
Yeah, even what you would consider high priority parts of that, things like, how do you treat them at slaughter? How do you slaughter them? Do you stun them first? How do you do that? Do you put them on ice? Is that a legitimate thing for all animals? And that varies from country to country as to whether or not you should be using ice slurries at all in terms of killing animals. So there's a lot that we don't know, and I think probably the Australian barramundi industry would be a very good example of a fairly well-developed industry where they are going down this path, but we're still a long way behind what we know in terms of salmonids.
Great discussion. We've got some more questions here for Culum, but I wonder if we might talk a little bit more about dolphins. So we've got Tigger Cross joining us. She's joining us instead of Stacy, who wasn't able to join us. And there's a question here that might go to you and potentially Stephanie as well. What do you think the future is for keeping cetaceans in human care? I know that's a bit of a tricky one, but try your best.
Well, I think that a lot of the public perception of dolphins and cetaceans, not just dolphins, but any types of cetaceans, like killer whales, there's a big movement after blackfish to not see these animals, like public perception of having them in zoos. They're just one of those contentious species, similar to elephants and apes, that people just have that category. I know in Australia there's only 2 facilities that currently house cetaceans, and worldwide there's less and less opening up in some of the more English-speaking countries, in some of the smaller nations where it's not as controlled or heavily monitored. Obviously there's still some opening up there while there's still public demand, but within Australia we do see that people want to know that the animals are in good positive welfare, which we do, and we think we educate a lot of people on what is important, not just to the dolphins, but sea lions, every type of species at our facility. But I think in the future of things, it does seem like in Australia anyway, is skewing away from facilities. No new facilities in Australia have opened up in 30, 40 years or something. So it's just something that I don't think will happen here, but worldwide, it's hard to say.
And a question for Stephanie in regards to the different shark control methods being used around Australia. How do you think, what do you think the future is going to look like, in the next sort of 10 to 20 years, as we see the emergence of more technologies and, better AI systems and things like that? Do you think we're going to see more sophisticated methods potentially for how to, I guess, and allow people into the water without having these conflicts of being encountering sharks in their natural environment? Oops, you're just on mute there, Stephanie. Might just get you to turn on your audio.
Sorry. Definitely, I think in the future there will be a lot of more such sophisticated methods to stop shark bites. There are a few studies using drones at the moment, and people trying to spot these large shark species and telling people not to go to the water, or looking at weather predictions, like I said during my presentation. So I feel like the meshes are going to be gone in like 20 years because they are not actually efficient. We might still have some drum lines, but probably more smart drum lines than the normal ones. Yeah, that's definitely going to look very different, and I think it will be a more efficient way probably of mitigating, managing these species and mitigating the shark bites.
Great, thank you. We're nearly out of time. This session has flown. Are there any final thoughts that we can get from any of our speakers that have something else they'd like to add? It's been really great to hear from you all.
I might just quickly visit the shark conversation, if I may. I mean, I think one of the things that's really changed in the last 10 years is the public perception of sharks, and we've gone from this sort of Hollywood-derived fear to a much greater appreciation of their roles in marine ecosystems. And because of that change, there's increasing pressure on the government to switch from this, 19th century approach to annihilating nature to doing something that's a little bit more technological and better for not just the people but for the animals as well.
I noticed from myself, I've seen some great drone footage that's shown shark interactions with swimmers where, they'll approach and just check it out and then go away. And I guess you're not just hearing about, the negative interactions, you're getting to see the diversity and the range of interactions that can happen with sharks, which I think it's a bit like I live in an environment where there's a lot of snakes, right? And we have a dam on our property that's currently with frogs, and we've got a lot of snakes around. But they're, generally happy to get out of our way. They're not a big threat as long as we're aware of them in the environment, and if we know that they're there, we give them their space. So yeah. I see a lot of parallels, but I've really enjoyed the fact that these emerging technologies give us a different perspective and can help us learn more about them, I guess, become more educated and see that behavior and then respond accordingly. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things I think that it's increasingly obvious as more and more drones get out there is just how many sharks are around. They're always there, all of the time. And, 999 times out of 1,000, they're not even remotely interested in swimmers.
Yeah. All right, well, with that, we're out of time. So thank you all very much. Thank you to James for being our chair, and to Culum and Tiggy for turning up in lieu of Stacy, and for Stephanie as well. We really enjoyed your talks about life under the water, and hope everyone comes back after the break. Check the program to see the time for the next session in your local time zone. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Let me do this.